The broadcast ended so abruptly that many viewers assumed something had gone wrong with the Fide royal correspondent appeared on screen looking drained as she delivered 11 words that sent a cold shock through Britain and America. The palace has ruled that Meghan has no future inside the monarchy. No bargaining, no softened phrasing, no space left for alternate meanings within moments. Newsroom phones lit up across the country. Commentators stared at one another, stunned. Even veteran royal watchers, the ones who had witnessed the era of Diana, the abdications and every kind of scandal, admitted they had never seen the palace choose such final and unmovable language. And the analysts were not alone. In homes across the United Kingdom, older viewers leaned in instinctively, sensing this was not just another dramatic headlines. Something deep and lasting had shifted. Once the first wave of shock settled, did the timeline slowly take shape? The message had been issued in the cold early hours of winter, during a period of rare internal strain. King Charles was in the hospital, weakened and unable to guide urgent discussions. The usual heart of royal authority had gone quiet, and whenever the top of the crown falls silent, other forces begin to move. That movement rose from two directions. Princess Anne, the unbroken spine of royal discipline, had grown increasingly wary of how Meghan continued to live in the public imagination. For Anne, leaving even a faint possibility of a royal return was not caution, it was chaos waiting for a spark. William, on the other hand, recognized the emotional price of republic engagement. He attended was overshadowed by one repeating question: will Meghan ever come back? And with his father too unwell to steady the institution, William understood that this uncertainty could not be allowed to spill into the new year. So the two of them acted quietly and firmly together. They compiled evidence, precedent, public sentiment, and the needs of the institution into a single winter briefing that shaped the message the palace eventually delivered. Which brings us to the thought echoing in the mind of every viewer: what drove the palace to make such a definitive choice, and why at this exact moment? Stay with me. The truth behind this announcement is far more complex, emotional, and far-reaching than anyone staring at that broadcast could imagine. To understand how the palace reached a decision this severe and irreversible, we have to return to the weeks leading up to the announcement, weeks defined not by dramatic scenes, but by a steady tightening of circumstances surrounding King Charles and the institution he represents. The King's hospitalization created a void the monarchy had not experienced in decades, with doctors watching him closely and his schedule frozen indefinitely. Charles was no longer the reliable anchor guiding day-to-day decisions. Briefings were shortened, documents reduced, and every conversation about the future of the crown carried a heavy unspoken question: what if Charles never regains full strength? Inside this growing uncertainty, the matter of Meghan's future, long pushed aside in hopes that time would ease old tensions, re-emerged with new urgency. Royal advisors noticed a concerning pattern. Every time Meghan launched a project or made a public appearance, world media pulled the monarchy back into storylines it was desperate to leave behind. American talk shows questioned the moral compass of the crown. British tabloids reignited old grievances. International media revived conflicts the institution was trying to quietly lay to rest. And with Charles unwell, the palace no longer had a strong monarch to cushion the fallout. William watched the situation unfold with mounting concern. He had spent years preparing for the moment he would need to become the steadying force of the monarchy, but preparation offered little comfort when the role arrived sooner than expected. What troubled him most was not Meghan herself, it was the wave she sent through every corner of public life. Her name alone could tilt public opinion, dim the impact of royal charity work, and drown out communication strategies crafted with precision. Princess Anne saw the issue from another direction. She was less focused on media storms and more alarmed by matters of tradition. To her, every headline hinting at a possible return for Meghan chipped away at the authority of the working royals. The ones who rose before sunrise, traveled endlessly, stood in bitter cold, and fulfilled their duties without complaint. Letting speculation linger was in her eyes a direct insult to the structure she had spent her life defending. Advisors reached the same conclusion: the monarchy could no longer tolerate with Charles weakened, not with succession approaching more visibly each day, not with the public asking for unmistakable clarity about who truly represented the crown. And so, in a discreet meeting inside a private hospital room, William and Anne presented their view: the palace must shut the door entirely and openly. That was the moment the path toward the December 3rd announcement was set in motion. The earliest signs of the shift, however, began long before that winter day. Subtle at first, then steadily impossible to ignore, and the first person to sense the change was Princess Anne. She had always possessed an almost instinctive awareness of instability inside the monarchy. She never waited for crises to erupt. She recognized the faint tremors long before others felt the shaking. It began with a series of unremarkable reports delivered to her office. These were routine summaries covering public mood, charity, visibility, and the tone of international coverage, usually straightforward, but this time, a pattern stood out. Every metric connected to Meghan showed an expanding divide between the United Kingdom and the United States and Britain. Especially among older citizens, her approval rating hovered at the bottom of national polls. People had moved past disappointment, they were simply tired. They felt she had taken too much from the institution while giving little back in the United States. However, the picture was more complex. Among Americans over 50, Meghan was viewed as both a figure of independence and a source of controversy. Daytime shows discussed her as if she were still woven into royal life. Magazines printed her Duchess title in bold attention grabbing fonts. Every step she took, whether a podcast tease, a business hint, or a red carpet appearance, was framed through the royal lens. To an esque was not harmless chatter, it was erosion of boundaries, erosion of certainty, erosion of the meaning the monarchy was meant to hold. Meanwhile, another set of reports arrived on William's desk. These outlined confusion from international partners uncertain about Meghan's current status. Global organizations preparing charity events asked if Meghan could still be considered connected to the royal family. Some even assumed she might return to official duties because American media continued using her title so prominently. For William, this was not merely inconvenient, was risky. It distorted messaging during a time when Charles' illness required absolute unity in the public's understanding of succession and stability. William had spent months trying to keep the monarchy from being reshaped by Meghan's ongoing narrative. But as her projects gained momentum, the crown was once again being pulled into debates it had not created. The moment the situation escalated arrived through an unexpected inquiry. Respected European foundation seeking attention for an upcoming campaign asked whether Meghan could take part and symbolically reconnect the monarchy with a younger generation. Their wording was diplomatic, but their assumption was unmistakable. To them, the door to Meghan still appeared wide open. That was the moment the warning became unmistakable. William carried the issue to the hospital where Charles was receiving care. The king, tired yet alert, listened from his bed as William described how Meghan's public profile had grown into a force the monarchy could no longer counterbalance. Charles closed his eyes, letting the seriousness of the matter settle over him. His voice was gentler now, weakened by treatment, yet still grounded. We cannot allow the world to misunderstand who speaks for the crown. Not now. But the most commanding voice in the room was not Charles, it was Anne. She had spent days studying the documents, gathering notes from charities, input from ambassadors, transcripts from broadcasters, and data from public sentiment. She saw a monarchy drifting closer to the influence of someone who no longer belonged to Ito. Her letting this confusion persist disrespected the commitment of every working royal. Spoke one sentence that hung in the room like a breath of winter air. We must stop giving the world the illusion of a door that does not exist. Those words changed the direction entirely. Across the ocean in California, Harry sensed the rising tension even before the announcement was drafted. Friends later shared that he had become quieter, unsettled. He felt his father's condition was worsening. He felt William taking on a firmer leadership role he felt that Meghan's growing spotlight in American media was reigniting a global debate. The palace was too fragile to withstand. Pieces were shifting, boundaries were blurring, and the point of no return was approaching. By the final days of November, William and Anne had reached their final judgment. The palace needed to speak decisively, clearly, and with no room left for interpretation. While Meghan continued expanding her presence in the United States, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace grew increasingly heavy. Advisors moved with urgency. Whispers lingered in corridors. Every department sensed that a decision of rare significance was forming, a decision that would demand coordination, unity, and a willingness to face the inevitable backlash. The turning point came with a burst of winter press coverage that swept across the monarchy like a cold wind. British newspapers released feature after feature questioning whether Meghan planned to rebuild her royal relevance. American media, meanwhile, speculated with excitement about a possible reconciliation between Meghan and the palace if Charles' condition worsened. Social media amplified both narratives until they spilled fully into the mainstream too. William, the unfolding situation felt like watching two forces collide in slow motion. He met with communication officers in a small room tucked inside the administrative wing of the palace. Laid out across the table were clippings from British tabloids with headlines reading Meghan's quiet road back and is the monarchy preparing for a Sussex revival. William touched one headline with the back of his pen, his face unreadable. This is the problem, he said softly. We have made no promises, yet the world keeps imagining them. Princess Anne entered moments later holding a separate stack of international correspondence. One letter from a Commonwealth charity asked whether Meghan might represent a modern arm of the institution at an event planned for the coming year. Another came from a U.S. media company asking whether a royal collaboration was permanently closed or only pauses to Anne. This was not innocent enthusiasm, as dilution, a slow weakening of the monarchy's ability to define its own identity. If the world believed Meghan might return, then the truth about who actually served the crown became obscured. She placed the folder in front of William. You see now why waiting is no longer possible, she said. William nodded. He had felt the pressure rising since the summer, but now that his father's illness had left the institution without its guiding voice, he and Anne carried the weight of protecting its future. Charles remained the king, yet his role had transformed into something quieter and more contemplative. Choices that once moved across his desk now landed in William's hands. First, meanwhile, Camilla observed the situation unfolding with a mixture of fatigue and concern, though she stayed away from the procedural details. She knew better than most how public narratives could twist into long-lasting harm. Her own decades of scrutiny had shown her that uncertainty was a breeding ground for disorder. When she spoke privately with Charles about the escalating noise around Meghan, her tone was gentle yet unyielding. The crown cannot survive in a world where its boundaries are optional. Back in the administrative wing, William and Anne examined the final briefing, a collected report outlining public confusion, risks to international messaging, media distortions, and the consequences of palace silence. Every department came to the same conclusion. The institution must deliver clarity itself. As the draft for the December 3rd statement formed, one line stood sharper than all others: there are no plans for future royal roles, patronages, or formal associations involving the Duchess of Sussex. This was the sentence that would define the message: firm, irreversible, clear. Before sending the document for final approval, William paused and met the eyes of the communications director. This will shock the world, he said, but remaining silent has become the greater danger. If you are watching from outside the United Kingdom, I would be honored to know which city or country you are joining us from. It is remarkable how stories like this travel beyond palace walls, shaping conversations across continents. Since Buckingham Palace preparations were finished, all that remained was to release the truth the world had been guessing at for years. When the palace drafted the December 3rd announcement, they anticipated a wave of reaction. What they did not expect was how swiftly the shock would spread once Meghan herself discovered the content. Long before the publicate was early morning in California when her team intercepted the internal alert. The document was unmistakably official, stamped, formatted, and written in the distinct voice of Buckingham Palace legal authority. Her strategist hesitated before handing her the tablet, as though the weight of its message might spill into the room. Meghan scanned the first line, expecting another routine clarification, but her face shifted the moment her eyes reached the central statements. The institution has determined there will be no consideration of future royal roles or patronages involving the Duchess of Sussex. She went still. For years Meghan had lived with strain between herself and the monarchy. Yet there had always been an unspoken belief that time might soften the divide. Whether through a family occasion, a diplomatic requirement, or the simple passing of years, she had assumed some form of small connection would remain. Not a return to royal duty, but a bridge that continued to exist. But this was the palace burning the bridge until only ash remained. Her voice was faint at first. They are closing the door on me, she whispered, almost to herself, but moments later, shock hardened into anger. They are doing this because they think they can get away with it while Charles is ill. Those standing around her said nothing. They understood that the truth was far more layered. The decision had been building for months, shaped by public mood, confusion surrounding her status, and the monarchy's urgent need for definition. But Meghan viewed the timing as intentional, ruthless, and deeply personal. Harry arrived a short while later, still shaking off sleep. He felt the atmosphere. The moment he stepped into the room, when Meghan handed him the tablet, he read the statement slowly, taking in a long, steady breath. There was no shock in his expression, only a quiet acceptance. You knew this was coming, she said, her voice sharp. I knew they were considering options, he replied carefully. Not something so absolute. But Harry understood what Meghan did not want to acknowledge. The monarchy could not function without firm boundaries, especially with his father's health in decline. William and Anne were not acting from resentment. They were acting to protect the institution, and, even though Harry still carried resentment of his own, he recognized the reasoning behind their decision. He sat beside her, rubbing his forehead. This is not about you, he said, softly. It is about holding everything steady while my father is in the hospital. But Meghan shook her head. Has always been about me. Every decision they make is about controlling the narrative, and now they are shutting down the possibility of mind across the ocean within Buckingham Palace. Tension filled the air, as well William and Anne had gathered in a secure room to finalize their plans for the public release. They knew the reaction would be intense. They knew American commentary would erupt. They knew their decision would be called harsh, even merciless, but they understood something that many of Meghan's supporters overlooked: the monarchy can only endure when its boundaries are unmistakable. William read through the final version of the announcement. "We are not attacking her," he said quietly. "We are closing the door on uncertainty, and steady and unwavering uncertainty has caused more harm than the truth ever could." Meanwhile, Meghan's team rushed to piece together a possible response. Some advised caution, others urged her to issue a statement condemning the timing, but Meghan stayed silent. Her silence carried more weight than any prepared message. What made this moment cut so deeply was not the announcement itself, it was what it represented: not punishment, not rejection, but inevitability. The monarchy had chosen clarity, and clarity arrived at her cost. As midday approached in London, the palace activated the release, and the world, already divided, braced for the impact. The announcement finally broke into public view. The reaction was immediate, worldwide, and more polarized than palace officials had anticipated. Television networks interrupted regular schedules. Radio hosts opened emergency phone lines. Commentators surged onto social platforms with interpretations, theories, emotions. Yet beneath the uproar, one truth settled with complete certainty: monarchy had spoken, and its words allowed no room for negotiation. Across the United Kingdom, reactions split sharply by generation. Older Britain's people, who had watched the crown endure wave after wave of turmoil, felt the statement was necessary. They had grown tired of Meghan's presence lingering like a shadow over every royal initiative. To them, the December 3rd announcement was not malice, it was relief, a way to end the endless push and pull between duty and disruption. Many said privately, "At last, the crown is moving forward." Younger audiences were far more divided. Some believed the palace had gone to war. Others argued that Meghan had stepped away long ago, and the announcement simply acknowledged what everyone already knew. Yet, even among them, there was a sense of inevitability. This chapter, dramatic as it was, had finally reached the moment it had been moving toward all along. Across the Atlantic, the reaction grew louder and more charged. American morning shows covered the news through themes of personal identity, and independent supporters of Meghan insisted she was being pushed aside for refusing to bend to tradition. Critics argued she had long used her title in ways that stirred controversy. Older American viewers, especially those who had followed the Oprah interview, the streaming series, and the memoir drama, felt deeply connected to the moment. Many sympathized with Meghan, while others saw the palace decision as a return to stability inside Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere shifted into something quiet and almost delicate. Staff members described the day as heavy yet necessary. With Charles still recovering in the hospital, the corridors felt colder, more restrained. William and Anne spent much of the afternoon guiding each department on the new communication approach. No speculation, no uncertainty, no hints about future reconciliation. One senior aide remarked that years of unclear expectations had weighed on everyone, and that the day finally brought direction. Camilla stayed mostly out of sight. Those close to her said she felt a mix of sadness and relief. She understood how public judgment could create lasting wounds, and she knew Meghan would take the decision personally, but she also believed the institution needed to reclaim space that had been overtaken by constant rumor. Harry felt the impact in a far more personal way. He spent much of the day in emotional limbo, trying to balance Meghan's hurt with the reality he knew could not be ignored. Friends later shared that he walked the Montecito grounds for nearly an hour, phone in hand, uncertain whether to call his father or remain silent. He knew Charles had not acted alone, and he knew the strain with William and Anne had been building toward this moment, but the truth was inescapably: door had closed. Evening settled over London, and the cold air gathered around the palace rooftops. It became clear that December 3rd would be remembered as one of the defining days of the era. After Elizabethite was the day the monarchy drew a line it could no longer leave blurred. As the world processed the unexpected declaration, something deeper rose beneath the news cycles and heated commentary. This was more than a royal update. It became a cultural mirror, reflecting Britain, America, and anyone watching a family struggle with the clash between public roles and private lives. And inside that reflection was a lesson that felt strangely universal. For years, Meghan's story had been shaped as a struggle between personal ambition and a centuries-old institution. She stepped into a system older than entire nations, carrying hopes, perspectives, and personal history that did not align neatly with its traditions. And the monarchy, rigid, ceremonial, and unbending, responded in the only way it knows: by protecting its structure before its emotions. In many ways, this echoed the tone of politics across both nations. British Leaders often speak of protecting national identity, while American voices emphasize defending personal autonomy. Those two philosophies collided within the Meghan story long before the palace issued any statement to much of the British public, especially older generations. The monarchy is not spectacle, it is legacy to many Americans. Meghan is not a duchess, she is an individual pushing back against an institution. When two cultures honor two different truths, conflict becomes unavoidable. What stands out most now is not the conflict itself, it is the cost of letting misunderstanding grow until decisive action is the only path left. The palace did not reach its decision because of a single interview or documentary or headline. It was the weight of years. It made its announcement because years of mixed signals had built up so high that the institution could no longer see past them. In any form of leadership, whether guiding a monarchy, a company, or a household, uncertainty can cause more damage than direct confrontation. A British commentator remarked on air that a crown cannot serve two interpretations. Later that evening, an American analyst replied that a woman cannot carry two identities that cancel each other out. Both captured part of the truth, yet neither reached its full depth. Trying to stand in two worlds without fully belonging to either eventually pulls a person apart. There is another lesson hidden in timing. When a figure of authority weakens, when doubt spreads, those with resolve step forward. William and Anne were not driven by spite, they were driven by obligation and duty. In fragile moments sharpens into something less forgiving and more absolute. Leadership under pressure often demands choices that wound individuals yet secure the stability of the whole. In politics, in families, and in private moments of crisis, we learn who steps up and who retreats. Then there is Harry, suspended between love and lineage, caught in a storm he did not start yet cannot escape. His challenge reflects something many people understand. When two parts of your life collide, when loyalties twist against each other, silence becomes both shelter and confinement. His path shows that healing cannot begin until expectation gives way to acceptance, and acceptance only arrives once clarity settles, even when that clarity feels like loss. For Meghan, her path is no longer tied to the palace, and perhaps this is where her real story begins. The door that closed today may feel devastating, but sometimes clarity, even painful clarity, releases us from waiting for something that is never coming back. The question now is no longer whether she has a place within the monarchy. The question is whether she can build a life that no longer depends on one. From where I stand watching this unfold feels like witnessing a broader conversation rising to the surface. Conversation about tradition versus transformation, structure versus self-expression, legacy versus reinvention. These tensions are not unique to royalty. They play out in marriages, workplaces, governments, and friendships. We all reach moments where we must decide which version of ourselves we choose to honor, and maybe that is the true meaning behind this story. Identity is not something handed to us, is something we shape, protect, and rewrite through the choices we make when no crowd is cheering. Meghan has reached that point. The palace has as well, and the world is simply witnessing the aftermath on a grand public stage. Where the story goes from here is unknown, but uncertainty is the birthplace of reinvention, and often the only real path forward begins at the exact moment a door finally closes behind us. Thank you for staying until the